Thank you very much for coming today. Sorry, I didn't give you guys a chance to respond. Aloha! Aloha! My name is Charles Lee. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Honolulu Zoo Society. And also joining us today are our Honolulu Zoo Director, Baird Fleming, as well as Kiva Minami and Trenton Yasui from the Hawaii State Department of Agriculture. I would also like to acknowledge all the staff and supporters from the Zoo, Zoo Society, and HDOA for being here. And I'd like to acknowledge some very important guests in the form of our live animal specimens today. And what these 4 species all have in common is that they are invasive species. So just a brief recap for everyone. Invasive species are organisms. They are animals, plants, fungus, bacteria, and according to Tom Friedman, Donald Trump, that when introduced to a native habitat, actually threaten the lives of native species, either because they compete for the same resources, either because they spread disease, or they straight up eat the native species. And in isolated ecosystems such as Hawaii, this threat is more serious than others. And that's why we ask any of you, if you're out in Hawaii and you see an exotic species, one that doesn't belong here, please call the pest hotline. That's 643-7378. That's 643-PEST. And this actually puts you into contact with inspectors from the HDOA. These are the hard-working men and women that are out there every day, patrolling the ports, inspecting incoming cargo, and making sure that stowaway species don't slip past security. And their work takes them into the community, even into people's homes sometimes, to capture and confiscate, again, exotic invasive species. Rest assured though, HDOA and the Honolulu Zoo ensure that whatever they capture or confiscate, they make sure these animals have a happy, healthy life. And this is where the partnership with the zoo comes in. Our keepers and managers provide expert care and guidance on how to take care of these wayward exotics. And sometimes, permits permitting, the zoo is able to adopt these animals straight up and give them a permanent home on display. And this is where outreach comes in, because live animal displays and demonstrations help people appreciate these unique animals and their adaptations and how they're able to survive in their own habitats and just why they shouldn't belong in ours. So the 4 animals today are examples of invasive species that, again, you can look out for. The first one I'd like to bring up, for those of you who spent time on the Big Island, if you do not recognize them by sight right away, you will definitely recognize them by sound. And I can already see some people cringing. So this is the coqui frog. And at night, their mating calls drive residents up the walls. But it's not just the noise pollution you have to watch out for. They also eat native insects. And this is a big deal in Hawaii because, again, invertebrates have the highest level of endemism out of any animal group. And again, endemism refers to the fact that they are found nowhere else in the world. Speaking of which, the coqui frog itself is actually from the islands of Puerto Rico, and because they have no natural predators here, their population density in Hawaii is actually a lot greater than in their own native range. The same can be said for our next animal, the Cuban night anole. So these large lizards are not only territorial, they're also extremely aggressive, and they've actually been observed attacking birds. So they're a threat not only to native invertebrates, but also to our native ground-dwelling and honeycreeper species, such as the apapane. This is one of several dozen endemic honeycreepers, all descended from a single ancestral finch species. It's actually been said that had Charles Darwin made it to Hawaii instead of just the Galapagos, he would have published his theory of evolution that much sooner. Unfortunately, a number of these honeycreepers are already extinct. Many are endangered, and many more are going to follow down that path unless we continue to control the spread of invasive species. In particular, one of the big threats to them right now is disease, avian malaria and avian pox. And for a long time, these birds have been able to avoid this disease by staying in the cold layer in the mountains, where the carriers of these diseases can't venture. Unfortunately, with climate change, the weather's getting warmer, and the carriers for these diseases, namely mosquitoes, are making it up to the birds. And by the way, although I said that we do try to give these captured exotic species a happy, healthy life, this is my personal opinion. Mosquitoes are the one animal you don't have to keep alive. So yeah, feel free to just slap them on sight. So the next animal we have, this beautiful brightly colored lizard hanging upside down, is the giant Madagascar day gecko. And these are actually competitors for with the honey creepers for the same food resources, namely, again, native invertebrates, but also nectar from native plants. In Hawaii, our native animals and plants co-evolve together, and the birds and insects, as mentioned earlier, serve as pollinators for plants such as the ohia. And if this day gecko was going to displace them, it would not be able to fulfill that same role, leading to a loss of our native forests. And this actually negatively affects us. We have a saying in Hawaii, the rain follows the forest, and it's actually backed by scientific evidence. Studies have shown that forests that have been replanted with non-native plants pale in comparison to native forests in their ability to soak up orographic rain. That's the rain that falls over the mountains. And what happens is the fresh water actually follows the roots of the native plants into the lava rock, where it's filtered and ends up in our aquifer. That's where the fresh water in Hawaii comes from. We would not be able to survive without our native forests, and they cannot continue to survive under the threat of invasive species. And this is a bit ironic because these giant day geckos were brought in to beautify Hawaii, because clearly it's not already paradise unless you have giant lizards running around. And incidentally, they are not the best pet material. Their skin is actually very delicate, so they don't like being handled. And speaking of delicate skin, their bite can actually puncture yours. So again, definitely not pet material. The last animal we have, the Jackson's chameleon, definitely was brought in as a pet, and you can still find them in pet shops today. But again, these aggressive animals are a threat to our native invertebrates, specifically our Hawaiian tree snails. And I know you already passed around some of the shells earlier, but just to give you an idea, these mollusks with their vibrant rainbow shells are like no other snail species groups in the world. And in fact, entire songs and chants have been written and dedicated to their beauty. It used to be that you could wander up hiking for half an hour, and you could come back with 300 snail shells. That's how abundant they were. Unfortunately, their numbers have gone into drastic decline. In fact, one individual, or one species, Acatenella apex fulva, is again the last known individual of its kind, and he's been that way for several years living at the Manoa Snail Lab. Still holding on though, so there's always hope. But this is largely due to invasive species such as the cannibal snails, rats, and of course the Jackson chameleons, which swallow these animals whole. And I wish I could say that today's 4 herps are the only herps on our invasive species list, but that list is a long one, and not all of the entries are even animals. The rapid ohia death that was mentioned earlier, that's actually caused by a fungus, and we already lost about 40,000 acres of ohia forest on the Big Island. The good news is that right now it's only concentrated on the Big Island. And again, Department of Agriculture is doing their best to keep it that way by monitoring the transport of ohia and ohia products between islands. And of course, they're also doing their best to keep other invasives out, such as these guys. The top one is the crazy ant. Emphasis on the crazy. They actually attack the nostrils and eyes of both pets and children, causing blindness. So they actually represent a threat to human safety. Another one is the brown tree snake. And while there are no native snakes in Hawaii, these guys are especially hazardous because we've already seen firsthand how they can wipe out the native bird populations on Guam. Anyone who's also lived on Guam can tell you how they cause numerous power outages and blackouts by climbing the power line. So these are some of the tops on our most unwanted list, so much so that we couldn't even afford to bring them here today. And again, if you see them or any other exotics, please call 643-PEST, the pest hotline. And this applies to exotic species you see not only out in the wild, but in people's homes sometimes. Now, there are sometimes illegal pet owners who bring these animals in, and they are not trying to release them out into the wild most of the time, but sometimes we all make mistakes, whether the animal gets out on its own or it becomes too much to handle. We just want you to know that it's okay. We understand that. And that's why the Department of Agriculture has an amnesty program. Anyone who surrenders an illegal exotic animal to the zoo or to the HDOA gets off scot-free. No questions asked, no harm, no foul, because we are not trying to punish people. We just want to make sure that these animals don't make it into the wild. And as I mentioned before, sometimes the zoo is able to adopt these wayward exotics, and here are a few of the ones that have found happy homes on display at the zoo. And their former owners, of course, can come visit them, and we actually invite all of you to come visit as well. The Honolulu Zoo is probably the one place in Hawaii where these animals are able to belong, contained and on display for the public so that people can appreciate them and continue to learn about them. Certainly not in a private person's home, and certainly not in the wild. And so zoos continue to serve this important purpose in society, to connect the public with wild exotic species that, again, do not belong in the native habitats of that region. And I'd like to point out that HDOA is also having an open house for the rest of this Conservation Congress. If you have time, please go visit them and some of their other captive display animals and learn more about what they do. For now though, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. Again, my name's Charles Lee, and we'd like to open this floor to questions as well as give you a chance to come see these animals up close if you haven't already. Thank you very much.